"What happened to me was terrible," she began, her voice clear and strong. "But what happened after shows the power of a community that refuses to accept injustice. Every braid in my hair today represents someone who stood up, spoke out, or made a change. We're all connected now, woven together like these strands, stronger together than we ever could be alone." The changes weren't perfect, and there was still work to be done. But Maya's story had become a beacon of hope, proving that even the darkest moments could lead to light. Her grandmother had been right. She had grown back stronger. Not just her hair, but her spirit, her community, and her belief in the possibility of change. As she finished her speech, Maya touched one of her new braids, feeling its strength beneath her fingers. Each plait told a story of loss and recovery, of injustice and justice, of hatred and love. But most importantly, they told the story of a community that had learned to stand together, proving that when ordinary people choose to do what's right, extraordinary change is possible. 3 months had passed since that fateful night, and spring had brought new growth to both the city and Maya's spirit. The morning sun streamed through the windows of Crowning Glory Salon, where Maya sat surrounded by care and community. The owner, a woman who had been braiding hair for over 30 years, worked with gentle fingers, weaving new patterns into Maya's regrown hair. "Your hair has come back so strong," the stylist said, her experienced hands moving with practiced grace. Maya caught her own reflection in the mirror and for the first time in months fully smiled. Her hair was shorter than before, but like her grandmother had predicted, it had grown back with a new resilience. The salon had become more than just a place for hair care. It had transformed into a sanctuary where women and girls gathered to share stories, find strength, and support each other. Today, as Maya got her first full head of braids since the incident, other customers shared their own experiences of overcoming adversity. At the bookstore where Maya worked, things had changed too. Her manager had promoted her to lead the store's new social justice book club, which met every Wednesday evening. The first book they discussed was about community activism and peaceful resistance. The club had started with just a few members, but had grown to fill the entire reading corner. Maya's story had sparked real change in the police department. The new Civilian Oversight Committee, on which Mrs. Lee now served as a founding member, had real power to investigate complaints and recommend policy changes. Lieutenant Wong, recently promoted to captain, had implemented mandatory community engagement programs where officers spent time working with local youth. The old guard of the police force had initially resisted these changes, but seeing the positive results was changing minds. Crime rates hadn't gone up, they'd actually dropped as community trust in law enforcement grew stronger. Officers reported feeling more connected to the people they served, and complaints against the police had decreased significantly. In the courthouse, Barrett's case had become a landmark. His conviction sent a clear message that abuse of power would not be tolerated. But more importantly, it had led to the review of hundreds of similar cases nationwide. Police departments across the country were adopting the Thompson Protocols, named in Maya's honor, which set strict guidelines for officer conduct and accountability. Maya's parents had channeled their pain into purpose. Her father joined the Police Academy's Civilian Advisory Board, helping shape the training of new officers. Her mother started a support group for families affected by police misconduct, creating a space where healing could happen through shared understanding and advocacy. The local high school had made its own changes. Maya's experience became part of the curriculum in social studies classes, teaching students about civil rights, community action, and the power of standing up for justice. The school's policy on hair discrimination was rewritten, explicitly protecting students' right to wear cultural and protective hairstyles. Mrs. Lee's alteration shop had become a symbol of active citizenship. People would stop by just to thank her for her courage that night. She'd hung a small photo on her wall, Maya in her altered prom dress, smiling broadly, surrounded by friends. Below it, she'd written in elegant calligraphy, "Courage is contagious." Maya's grandmother had moved in permanently, saying she needed to be close to her brave granddaughter. Together, they started a YouTube channel where they shared stories of their family's history, taught traditional braiding techniques, and discussed the importance of standing up for what's right. Their videos reached thousands, spreading messages of empowerment and cultural pride. The college acceptance letters had started arriving. Maya had written her application essay about that night and its aftermath, not focusing on the trauma, but on the healing and change that followed. Universities were impressed by her resilience and leadership. Several offered full scholarships, recognizing the kind of student who would make their campus stronger. One ordinary Tuesday, Maya stood before the city council. She'd been invited to speak about the impact of the changes implemented since her incident. Looking out at the crowded chamber, she saw familiar faces: Mrs. Lai, Lieutenant Wong, her parents, her grandmother, the salon owner, her bookstore manager, and dozens of community members who had become part of her extended family. Maya's grandmother sat with her that evening, gently applying oil to her damaged scalp. "You know," she said softly, "our hair grows back stronger after it's cut. And baby, you're going to grow back stronger too." Her words carried the weight of generations who had faced injustice and emerged unbroken. The city council had fast-tracked new legislation requiring psychological evaluations for all officers and establishing a civilian oversight board with real power. These weren't just reactive measures, they were the foundation of lasting change, bought at too high a price but necessary for a better future. As night fell, Maya opened her laptop to find thousands of messages of support from around the country. But the one that touched her most came from a young officer in training who wrote, "Your story changed how I view my responsibility to the community. Thank you for being stronger than those who tried to break you." The county courthouse buzzed with activity early Monday morning. District Attorney Reynolds had come in on Sunday, something she rarely did, to personally review the evidence against Officer Barrett. Now she stood before Judge Wilson, her voice clear and unwavering as she listed the charges. "Your Honor, the state brings forth charges of assault, battery, civil rights violations, and official misconduct," she began. The courtroom was packed, with every bench filled. Maya's parents sat in the front row, their backs straight, their faces composed. Behind them, Mrs. Lai sat with Lieutenant Wong, both ready to testify if needed. Barrett sat at the defendant's table, his police uniform replaced by a suit that seemed to hang loosely on his frame. His attorney had advised him to look remorseful, but his eyes still held that hint of arrogance that had led him to believe he could act with impunity. The evidence presentation was methodical and overwhelming. First came Mrs. Lee's video, its clarity leaving no room for doubt. Then the body camera footage, which Barrett had forgotten to disable in his moment of power-drunk cruelty. The security cameras from surrounding businesses added their silent testimony, showing the incident from every angle. The defendant didn't just violate Ms. Thompson's civil rights, the DA continued, displaying photos of Maya's injuries. He violated the trust placed in him by this community. He violated his oath to protect and serve, and he did this to a minor, a child who had done nothing wrong. Barrett's attorney tried to argue for leniency, citing his client's years of service, but those very years worked against him as the prosecution revealed a pattern of complaints that had been buried or ignored. Maya wasn't the first person he'd mistreated. She was just the first with irrefutable video evidence and a community unwilling to look away. The judge's gavel cracked like thunder in the hushed courtroom. "Bail is set at $500,000, he announced, and given the severity of these charges and the overwhelming evidence, this court finds probable cause to proceed with immediate prosecution." Barrett's face finally showed real fear as he was led away in handcuffs. The same walk of shame he had forced on countless others was now his to experience. His attorney's attempts to arrange immediate bail fell flat. No bondsman in the city would touch his case. Outside the courthouse, Maya stood with her parents as their attorney addressed the media. The young girl's quiet strength spoke volumes more than any prepared statement could. She had traded her bookstore uniform for a beautiful head wrap, donated by a local shop owner who understood the significance of helping Maya reclaim her identity. "Today, we saw the system work the way it's supposed to," the attorney announced. "But let's be clear, it worked because this community demanded it work. Because brave people like Mrs. Lee refused to stay silent. Because good officers like Lieutenant Wong chose integrity over blind loyalty." The press conference was interrupted by breaking news. The police union had voted not to provide Barrett with legal support. This unprecedented move sent shockwaves through the law enforcement community. The union president's statement was brief but powerful. "We protect our own, but Officer Barrett's actions are indefensible." He betrayed his badge, his oath, and most importantly, the trust of a child in our community. Back at the precinct, officers were already attending newly implemented training sessions. The instructor, a respected civil rights attorney, didn't shy away from hard truths. What happened to Maya Thompson could have been prevented, she told the room. Today, we're learning how to ensure it never happens again. Local law students had volunteered to review Barrett's past cases, looking for similar incidents that might have gone unreported. Their findings would eventually lead to several overturned convictions and a deeper cleaning of the department's ranks. The day ended with Barrett in a jail cell, his bail unmet, his career in ruins. But more importantly, it ended with Maya surrounded by love and support, working with a trauma counselor who specialized in helping young people process police encounters. The counselor had offered her services pro bono, understanding that healing needed to start immediately. The city council called an emergency session to discuss police oversight. The meeting room overflowed with concerned citizens. People who had never spoken at a council meeting found their voices, sharing their own experiences and demanding change. The council members, faced with this unified show of community concern, couldn't resort to their usual political delays. A local tech company offered to fund body camera upgrades for the entire police force, cameras that couldn't be turned off and automatically uploaded footage to secure servers. Another business promised to sponsor de-escalation and cultural sensitivity training. These weren't just empty gestures, they were investments in preventing future incidents. As evening approached, the Thompson family's front yard had become an impromptu gathering place for supporters. Someone had planted flowers. Others had left cards, gifts, and letters of support. The family's neighbors organized a security patrol to ensure their privacy was protected from intrusive media attention. Maya watched it all unfold from her living room window, surrounded by her family's love and her community's support. Her grandmother had arrived from out of town, bringing with her decades of wisdom and strength. Sometimes, she told Maya, it takes one person's pain to wake up a whole community. But baby, look at all these people standing up. They're not just standing for you, they're standing with you. By sunrise the next morning, Maya's story had spread through social media like wildfire. The video Mrs. Lee captured had been shared thousands of times, each repost carrying messages of support, outrage, and calls for justice. But this wasn't just another viral moment, this was a community coming together in real, tangible ways. The local news vans arrived outside the police station just as Police Chief Richardson called an emergency press conference. The station's steps were already crowded with community members, their handmade signs speaking volumes. Protect our children, not your bad officers, and Justice for Maya stood out among dozens of others. Inside the station's conference room, Chief Richardson stood before a forest of microphones, his usual polished demeanor showing cracks of genuine emotion. What happened last night isn't just a violation of police procedure, he began, his voice firm. It's a violation of basic human dignity, of the trust placed in us by our community, and of everything the badge represents. The chief's words carried extra weight because everyone knew his own daughter wore her hair in braids. This wasn't just professional for him, it was personal. Officer Barrett has been terminated, effective immediately, he announced. We're also conducting a full review of all his previous arrests and interactions with the public. Outside the police station, Maya's story had brought together people who might never have crossed paths otherwise. Mrs. Lai stood with her fellow small business owners from Oak Street. The bookstore where Maya worked had closed for the day, its windows displaying a large sign, "Standing with Maya." Regular customers who knew her from countless book recommendations shared stories of her kindness and dedication. The local hair braiding salon, Crowning Glory, announced they would provide free services to Maya when she was ready. Hair is more than just hair in our community, the owner explained to reporters. It's our culture, our identity, our crown. What that officer did wasn't just assault, it was an attempt to strip away dignity. At Maya's high school, students organized a peaceful walkout. The principal, instead of trying to stop them, joined in. Hundreds of teenagers, teachers, and parents gathered in the school courtyard. Maya's best friend read a statement from the Thompson family, her voice strong despite her tears. Maya wants you all to know that she's hurt, but not broken. She's scared, but not defeated. And most importantly, she's grateful for this incredible showing of support. Local civil rights organizations mobilized with impressive speed. The Urban Justice Center announced they would represent Maya pro bono, and their lead attorney didn't mince words during her press statement. This isn't just about one officer or one incident. This is about systemic issues that need to be addressed. But make no mistake, we will start by ensuring Officer Barrett faces every possible consequence for his actions. Social media continued to amplify the story. Verified accounts of celebrities and activists shared the video, each bringing new waves of support. But more importantly, they shared resources. Information about police accountability, links to organizations working for reform, and ways to support similar cases that hadn't gone viral. The police department's social media accounts, usually filled with community outreach posts and safety tips, transformed into a real-time demonstration of accountability. They shared updates about the investigation, policy changes being implemented, and resources for reporting police misconduct. It wasn't perfect, but it was a start. Local businesses near where the incident occurred came forward with additional security camera footage. The coffee shop, the pharmacy, and even the bank across the street provided their recordings, building an ironclad case. Each new angle showed the same thing, an abuse of power that couldn't be explained away. By afternoon, mental health professionals from the community had set up a support center at the local library. It wasn't just for Maya, it was for everyone triggered by the incident, everyone who saw their own children in her story, everyone who needed to process the trauma of witnessing such injustice. The night had turned the corner from tragedy to justice, but Maya's ordeal wasn't over. She would need to give statements, see doctors, talk to counselors. But looking around at the circle of support that had formed, her parents, Mrs. Lai, Lieutenant Wong, the paramedic, even the strangers bringing water and chairs, she knew she wouldn't face any of it alone. Officer Barrett was escorted to a waiting patrol car, his former authority stripped away with his badge and gun. As he was placed in the back seat, the same space where he had transported countless others, the weight of his actions seemed to finally hit him. His face, once twisted with unearned power, now showed the first hints of fear. Fear of consequences, fear of justice, fear of the system he had abused being turned toward truth. The screech of police cruiser tires against asphalt broke through the tension like a thunderclap. Lieutenant Wong stepped out first, his 20 years of experience evident in every measured movement. He took in the scene in seconds, Maya still in handcuffs, her once beautiful braids scattered on the ground, Officer Barrett's hand still gripping his pocket knife, and Mrs. Lee's phone recording everything from her shop doorway. Release her immediately. Wong's voice carried the weight of authority that came not from a badge, but from a deep sense of justice. Two younger officers flanked him, their faces a mixture of shock and determination. Wong had handpicked them for their integrity, and tonight, that choice would prove crucial. Barrett's swagger faltered as he faced his superior officers. His hand holding the pocket knife dropped to his side, but he attempted to maintain his facade of authority. "Sir, I had reasonable suspicion," he began, but Wong cut him off with a sharp gesture. "Officer Miller, secure that knife as evidence," Wong commanded. "Officer Chen, please remove those handcuffs from Ms. Thompson and check if she needs medical attention." The younger officers moved with precise efficiency, their training kicking in despite the unprecedented situation. Maya's parents' car pulled up just as Officer Chen was removing her handcuffs. Mrs. Thompson burst out of the passenger seat before the car fully stopped, her heels clicking rapidly against the pavement as she ran to her daughter. Mr. Thompson followed close behind, his normally gentle face set in stone, his hands clenched but controlled. "Baby, I'm here." Mrs. Thompson wrapped her arms around Maya, her voice breaking as she felt her daughter trembling. Mr. Thompson enveloped them both in his embrace, creating a fortress of family love around their child. But Maya's father kept one eye fixed on Barrett, his gaze carrying the weight of every parent who'd ever feared for their child's safety at the hands of those meant to protect them. Lieutenant Wong was already reviewing the body camera footage on a tablet, his face growing darker with each passing second. "Officer Barrett, remove your weapon belt," he ordered, his tone leaving no room for argument. "Officer Miller, please secure it." The sound of the belt being unbuckled seemed to echo in the night air. Mrs. Lai had come down from her shop, carrying a clean black garment bag. With gentle hands, she and Mrs. Thompson began carefully gathering Maya's braids from the ground, preserving the evidence while also showing respect for what these braids represented: hours of cultural tradition, family bonding, and personal identity that Barrett had tried to destroy. The growing crowd of onlookers from nearby businesses kept a respectful distance, but their presence added weight to the moment. Someone had brought out chairs from the coffee shop next door, offering them to Maya and her parents. Another person arrived with bottles of water, small gestures of humanity that stood in stark contrast to Barrett's cruelty. "We've reviewed enough," Lieutenant Wong announced, turning to Barrett. "Officer James Barrett, you are being placed under arrest for assault, civil rights violations, and misconduct under color of authority." The words rang out clear in the night air as Officer Chen began reading Barrett his rights. Maya watched from within her parents' embrace as Barrett's own handcuffs were secured around his wrists. The same handcuffs he had used to restrain countless others were now restraining him. The irony wasn't lost on anyone present. A female paramedic had arrived and was gently examining Maya's scalp, checking for any cuts or injuries from Barrett's rough handling. "You're so strong," the paramedic whispered, her gentle hands a healing contrast to Barrett's violence. "We'll document everything carefully." Lieutenant Wong approached the Thompson family, his usual commanding presence softened with genuine concern. "Ms. Thompson," he addressed Maya directly, showing her the respect she'd been denied. "I want you to know that this will be handled with the utmost seriousness. We have multiple video recordings, witnesses, and his own body camera footage. He will face consequences." Mr. Thompson stepped forward, his voice steady despite his emotion. "We want to file formal charges. All of them. Every single violation." One nodded, understanding flowing between the two men. "Our Civil Rights Division is already being notified, and the District Attorney's Office has been contacted." This isn't going away. Maya's parents' car pulled up just as the other officers were securing the scene. Mrs. Lee finally lowered her phone and stepped outside her shop, her small frame straight and dignified. She had trash bags in her hands, clean ones, meant for garment storage, and she walked carefully to where Maya's braids lay scattered. These pieces of Maya's identity wouldn't be left in the street like garbage. They would be gathered with respect, with care, with love. The night air had grown colder, but the atmosphere crackled with the heat of justice about to be served. Mrs. Lai had spent her life making things fit properly, adjusting what was wrong until it was right. Tonight, she'd helped to exactly that, not with needle and thread, but with courage and a phone camera. Sometimes, she thought, the strongest weapon against injustice was simply refusing to look away. Mrs. Lee's hands shook as she reached for her phone, but her resolve was steady. For 15 years, she'd watched the neighborhood's children grow up from her little alteration shop. She'd hemmed Maya's first school uniform, taken in her middle school graduation dress, and just last week had started working on her prom dress, a beautiful blue silk that Maya had saved up for from her bookstore job. The veteran seamstress had lived through enough history to know that silence in the face of injustice made you complicit. Her own grandmother had taught her that lesson long ago, in another country, in another time. Now, watching this horror unfold through her shop window, Mrs. Lee knew exactly what she had to do. Her fingers moved swiftly across her phone screen, first dialing 911, then hitting the record button. Years of precise needlework had given her hands a stillness that served her well now as she documented everything. "I need to report an officer. He's hurting a young girl," she spoke clearly into the phone, her accent thick with emotion, but her words precise. "Outside Golden Thread Alterations on Oak Street. Please hurry." The 911 operator's voice was professional, controlled. "Units are already on their way, ma'am. Can you tell me what you see?" Mrs. Lai described the scene with the same attention to detail she used when examining fine stitching. Every cut of Maya's braids, every movement of Barrett's hands, every violation of trust captured in clear, simple terms. But Mrs. Lee knew calling 911 wasn't enough. She'd altered enough police uniforms to know that some officers could be trusted, and she had one particular number saved in her phone. Lieutenant Wang had been bringing his uniforms to her shop for a decade, always stopping to chat, always treating her with respect. Her trembling fingers found his contact. "Lieutenant, this is Mrs. Lee from the alterations shop. There's an officer. He's doing something terrible." I've called 911, but you need to know. Her words tumbled out in a mix of English and Mandarin, but the urgency translated perfectly. Lieutenant Wong's response was immediate. I'm sending our best people, Mrs. Lai. Keep recording. Stay safe. Through her phone's screen, Mrs. Lai watched as Maya stood dignified despite her tears, despite her restraints, despite everything being taken from her. The girl who always greeted her with a bright smile and asked about her day in carefully practiced Mandarin phrases now stood in handcuffs, her beautiful braids scattered on the dirty pavement like fallen leaves. The shop owner's next call was to the Thompsons. She had their number from Maya's recent prom dress fitting. Mrs. Thompson answered on the second ring, her warm voice turning to ice as Mrs. Lai explained what was happening to her daughter. We're 3 minutes away, Maya's mother said, her voice tight with controlled fury. Keep watching over our baby. Mrs. Lee's small shop had become command central in a rapidly unfolding drama. Her security cameras, installed after a break-in last year, were capturing everything from another angle. She'd already emailed the footage to her cloud storage, remembering her nephew's constant lectures about backing up important data. The sound of approaching sirens grew louder, but they seemed to take forever to arrive. In reality, it was only minutes. Mrs. Lee's ornate wall clock showed exactly how long, 7 minutes from her first call to the first flash of responding police lights. 7 minutes that felt like 7 lifetimes. Through her window, she watched Officer Barrett's demeanor change as he realized his actions had an audience. His movements became less aggressive but more agitated. Like a bully caught in the act, he tried to project authority even as it slipped through his fingers like water. The first responding patrol car screeched to a stop, then another and another. Mrs. Lee recognized Lieutenant Wong stepping out of the third vehicle, his face set in grim determination. The cavalry had arrived, but Mrs. Lee kept recording. She'd lived long enough to know that sometimes justice needed more than just official reports. It needed ordinary citizens willing to stand up and say, I saw this. This happened. This was wrong. Officer Barrett's demeanor changed like a storm cloud rolling across a sunny sky. His fingers drummed against Maya's license as he studied it with exaggerated slowness. Step out of the vehicle, he ordered, his voice carrying that edge of authority that left no room for question. Maya's mind raced. She knew her rights, but she also knew the reality of her situation. The evening air had grown cooler, or maybe it was just her fear making her shiver. Maya carefully unbuckled her seatbelt, keeping her movements slow and deliberate. Her phone lay silent in her bag on the passenger seat, and she wished more than anything she could reach for it, call her parents, call anyone. But Barrett's stern presence beside her door left no opportunity. I smell something suspicious, Barrett claimed, though the only scent in Maya's car was the vanilla air freshener her mom had bought her and the lingering aroma of the new books she'd helped unpack at work. Maya stood trembling slightly in her bookstore uniform, a neat polo shirt with the store's logo and clean black pants. Her name tag still pinned to her chest caught the streetlight. Maya, here to help you find your next adventure. Barrett circled her like a predator, his boots scraping against the asphalt. Maya kept her eyes forward, just as her parents had taught her. She could see the lights still on in Mrs. Lee's alterations shop across the street. The elderly seamstress often worked late, and Maya had dropped off her prom dress there just last week. Now she prayed Mrs. Lai would look up from her sewing machine, notice what was happening. These braids, Barrett said, his voice taking on a tone that made Maya's skin crawl. They could be hiding all sorts of things. The absurdity of his statement would have been almost laughable if it wasn't so terrifying. These were the same braids her grandmother had spent hours crafting, telling Maya stories about their family's heritage, about strength and pride and identity. The click of handcuffs echoed in the quiet street. This is for my safety, Barrett announced, though Maya had shown no resistance, no aggression, nothing but perfect compliance. The cold metal bit into her wrists, and tears began to well in her eyes. Not tears of weakness, tears of anger, of frustration, of the pure injustice of it all. Then came the sound that would haunt Maya's dreams, the soft scrape of a pocket knife being opened. Since you won't admit what you're hiding, Barrett's voice had taken on an almost gleeful tone, we'll have to find out for ourselves. Maya felt the first tug at her braids, and her grandmother's face flashed in her mind, the gentle hands that had woven love and history into every plate. "Please," Maya's voice cracked, but she refused to let it break. "This is illegal. You have no right." Her words seemed to bounce off Barrett like raindrops off a windshield. The first braid fell to the ground, severed roughly. Each cut felt like a violation, not just of her hair, but of everything it represented: her heritage, her identity, her basic human dignity. Barrett's body camera blinked its red light steadily, recording every moment of his abuse of power. He either didn't notice or didn't care, too caught up in his display of dominance. Maya stood straight-backed despite her trembling, refusing to give him the satisfaction of seeing her crumble. The sound of a door chime cut through the night air. Mrs. Lai had finally looked up from her work. Maya heard the gasp, then the quick shuffle of feet. More braids fell to the asphalt, forming a painful constellation around her feet. But now there were witnesses. Now there was hope. Time seemed to stretch like taffy, each second an eternity of humiliation and helplessness. But Maya Thompson, honor student, daughter, granddaughter, stood her ground. She kept her eyes fixed on the horizon, where the last traces of sunset were fading into night. She thought of her grandmother's stories, of ancestors who had endured far worse and emerged unbroken. What Barrett didn't understand, what people like him never understood, was that strength isn't measured by the power you hold over others, but by the power you maintain within yourself when others try to break you. And Maya Thompson was far from broken. As sirens began to wail in the distance, growing louder with each passing second, she knew this story wouldn't end the way Officer Barrett had planned. Justice was coming, swift and certain, like a tide that couldn't be turned back. The autumn evening was winding down as 16-year-old Maya Thompson pulled her well-maintained Honda Civic out of the small shopping plaza where she worked part-time at the local bookstore. The streets were quiet, painted in the soft orange glow of the setting sun. She had just finished her Thursday evening shift, where she'd spent hours organizing the new young adult section and helping customers find their perfect reds. Her manager had even complimented her on how she'd handled a particularly difficult customer with patience and grace. Maya glanced at her reflection in the rearview mirror, admiring the intricate braids her grandmother had lovingly crafted last weekend. It had taken 6 hours, but every minute was filled with stories, laughter, and the kind of wisdom only grandmothers could share. The braids were more than just a hairstyle. They were a crown of heritage, crafted with the same patterns her grandmother had learned from her mother back home. The drive home should have taken 15 minutes, just enough time to catch up with her best friend on the phone about tomorrow's chemistry test. They'd been studying together all week, and Maya felt confident about acing it. Her phone sat untouched in her bag, though. She always followed her parents' strict rule about no phone calls while driving. The flash of red and blue lights in her mirror came out of nowhere. Maya's heart skipped a beat, but she remained calm. She'd practiced this scenario with her parents countless times. "When you get pulled over," her father's voice echoed in her head, "slow down, signal, pull over safely. Keep your hands visible on the wheel. Stay calm. You've done nothing wrong." She followed each step precisely, pulling over into a well-lit area near a row of small businesses. Most were closed for the evening, but a few lights still glowed in windows. Maya turned down her radio, which had been softly playing her favorite indie rock station, and reached for her registration from the glove compartment before the officer approached. Through her side mirror, she watched Officer James Barrett approach. His heavy footsteps seemed to match her heartbeat. Something about his walk, the way he held his shoulders, made her uneasy. Still, Maya took a deep breath. She was a good student, had never been in trouble, and her car was in perfect condition. She'd just had it checked last week. "License and registration," Barrett demanded, his flashlight beam harsh against her eyes. Maya noticed he hadn't introduced himself or explained why he pulled her over. Her hands trembled slightly as she handed over her documents, but her voice remained steady as she asked, "May I ask why you pulled me over, officer?" Barrett's response about a broken taillight made no sense. Maya knew for certain all her lights were working. Her dad had checked them just yesterday during their weekly car maintenance routine. It was their Sunday tradition. He taught her about car care while they talked about life, school, and her dreams of becoming an architect. The situation shifted when Barrett's eyes fixed on her braids. His expression changed, a supple twist of his lips that made Maya's stomach turn. "That's quite the hairstyle you've got there," he remarked, his tone making the compliment sound like anything but. Maya stayed silent, her grandmother's voice in her head reminding her that sometimes silence was the best response. What happened next would be replayed on news channels and social media countless times in the following days. But in that moment, it was just Maya, alone with her fear, about to face something no one should ever have to experience. Her hands gripped the steering wheel tighter, her promise ring. A sweet 16 gift from her parents, catching the glint of Barrett's flashlight as the situation began to spiral out of control. The clock on her dashboard read 7:43 p.m. In just 10 minutes, everything would change, not just for Maya, but for an entire community that had grown too familiar with stories like hers. But this time, the story would have a different ending. This time, justice wouldn't wait.